Hello, welcome to this video. Here I will be reviewing and going over the basic ideas in Aphorisms 17, 18, and 19 from Nietzsche's book Beyond Good and Evil. This first opening section has been Nietzsche's sort of attack or critique at some of the major figures in philosophy at the time. Nietzsche's positioning himself to sort of revolutionized philosophy in some ways, and not without reason. So here he's going to be attacking someone who is considered a revolutionary himself, and Nietzsche's also going to be critiquing a core concept that has been at the very center of all of modern philosophy. So I think these three aphorisms are arguably some of the most important moving forward, and arguably the most important in terms of Nietzsche's conception of the will and his original conception of what it means to be a will, what it means to think, what it means to make decisions. Um, 17 begins with a reference to superstitions of logicians. He's attacking logicians, usually people who don't have many superstitions. So he's, setting himself up to say what is wrong with something that is very logical. So who is he going to attack? First off, he's going to attack René Descartes, so the father of modern philosophy, and the discoverer or creator of the cogito ergo sum proof of self, that I think therefore I am proof, that is, as it were, supposed to be immediately certain or absolutely certain. So what does Nietzsche have to say about this claim? Well, basically he's going to say it's not as certain as it seems. There's certain assumptions inherent in Descartes' claim, sort of hidden in the language itself, or maybe influenced by the way language works, that makes us think about this phrase, and thus think about the will in a specific way that Nietzsche doesn't see as justified. So even this seemingly absolutely certain phrase by Descartes, Nietzsche sees as not certain, and he sees this as a key superstition in modern philosophy, or the logicians here, and is going to separate himself from this field. So let's get into it. He is going to say that I shall never tire of emphasizing a small terse fact with these superstitious minds, which these superstitious minds hate to concede, namely that a thought comes when it wishes, and not when I wish, so that it is a falsification of the facts of the case to say that the subject I is the condition of the predicate think. So, I think, the language says a lot, Nietzsche says, or at least the language seems to imply a lot, and also convinces us to think in a certain way. So, I am an agent, that is thinking. Now, is this the same as something like I am writing a book, or I am riding my bike, or I am breathing? Well, no, it's going to end up being a little different, and we're going to have to really look at what it means to be an I. So what does Nietzsche say here? So uh, it thinks, but that this it is precisely the famous old ego is, to put it mildly, only a superstition, an assertion, and assuredly not an immediate certainty. To what degree are we in control of our own thoughts? Nietzsche's saying here that our thoughts are happening. It isn't really us that is doing the thinking. And if it is us that's doing the thinking, it's not us in the way that people like Descartes think it is. Like Schopenhauer, and we'll see this in 19. But why? Because the self for Nietzsche is not going to be a unified ego. It's not going to simply be the thing that thinks. The self is both the thing that thinks and not the thing that thinks, because we experience thoughts as they happen to us. There's a part that is sort of external to what we might call the ego. So, the idea that this ego is doing the thinking is only a supposition or a superstition, an assertion, and assuredly not an immediate certainty. After all, one has even gone too far with this "it thinks." What is the it? Why do actions require an agent, right? So it says even the it contains an interpretation of the process, a necessary connection of verb and subject. Grammar says we need a subject for every verb. So how dare we articulate thought without having an attached subject? Thought, as it were, is supposed to be a verb. But maybe it's some more similar to saying, like, it is windy outside, right? The pronoun it in that sentence, when we say it is windy outside, does not refer to any particular subject. It's referring to a sort of super subject, something that is simply a placeholder where there is no subject. It's the weather is the subject, or the atmosphere, or whatever. So, one infers here, according to the grammatical habit, thinking is an activity. Every activity requires an agent or a subject. Consequently, the I must be the thinking subject. It was pretty much according to the same schema that the older atomism was sought. Nietzsche already has critiqued atomism in this chapter. Atomism is the search for a sort of fundamental particle that is indivisible, and therefore can be the foundation of every other sort of physical model. In language, the I is the sort of indivisible thinking agent that is responsible for the mental activity that we want to lump into all this one category of being the activity of our free mind. So I think Nietzsche's going to end up saying that a lot less of our own mind is free or willing than some philosophers think it is. This is where the critique is going. So, he's still referring to the atom, so more rigorous minds learned at last to get along without this earth residuum. I think, the idea that we don't need something to be an indivisible ground upon which an infallible science can be constructed. There's more subtle and realistic ways to think about the way the world operates, and perhaps someday we shall accustom ourselves as logicians to get along without the little it, the ego, as the agent of thought. But how? Well, not so sure yet. What will this look like? I think part of this book is about this, and we're going to see this more in detail in 18 and 19. It should help us clarify what is going on here. So 18 is just a nice short passage that says, it is certainly not the least charm of a theory that it is refutable or falsifiable. Of course, in science you want falsifiable claims that can be shown to be false or otherwise proven, shown to be true. If I say that we live in a simulation, that's an unfalsifiable claim. Where would we start scientifically from that position? It's interesting to think about, but scientifically hard to go anywhere from there, or even philosophically. It sort of stands on its own. So, it seems that the 100 times refuted theory of a free will owes its persistence to this charm alone, which is to say that it is refutable. And again, someone comes along who feels they are strong enough to refute the existence of the free will. This is to say that, well, at least the claim about a free will is refutable. Plenty of people have tried to refute it, have argued on behalf of either some versions of fatalism or determinism, and in so doing, it's a lasting debate. The sort of lasting debates in philosophy are so for good reason, because they attract good disagreement. So there's something about the idea of the free will that is, it attracts subtle minds that are interested in arguing, debating, critiquing, because on the one hand, it is quite easy to critique the existence of the free will, but on the other hand, it's more challenging to defend it, and also a great challenge to understand what the will is at all, if it is free in some instances and not free in others, or what's going on here. So, 19 I think Nietzsche said 18 sets us up, and Nietzsche says, plenty people before me have just refuted the existence of the free will. Schopenhauer did so. He believed the will was not free. I think going back all the way in, can't think of any off the top, but 19. Philosophers are accustomed to speak of the will as if it were the best known thing in the world. Indeed, Schopenhauer has given us to understand that the will alone is really known to us, absolutely and completely known, without subtraction or addition. So Schopenhauer basically inherits Immanuel Kant's philosophy of there being a true nature to things in and of themselves. Schopenhauer posits that since we have direct access to our own will, our will is the most certain thing to us. It is also inside of us. So it's the true nature in and of things of themselves. So he thinks that Schopenhauer believes that the will is an evident given, that we are willing, but not freely willing. The will for Schopenhauer is an endless striving for desire, striving for more life experience, more of life. It's the will to life, not a free will. So, again and again, it seems to me that in this case, too, Schopenhauer did only what philosophers are in the habit of doing. He posited a popular prejudice and exaggerated it. Or he adopted a popular prejudice and exaggerated it, which is the idea of willing itself. Willing seems to me to be above all something complicated. So Nietzsche's going to take this concept of willing and break it open. So to say it's more complicated than we think it is, and this is going to give way to a new philosophy of what it means to will. So something that is a unit only as a word. To will is a singular thing. That's the prejudice. The key prejudice, or that willing is simply a singular thing. And it is precisely in this one word that the popular prejudice lurks, which has defeated the always inadequate caution of philosophers. So let us for once be more cautious. He's mocking the philosophers by saying he's really saying we should be more philosophical than the philosophers so far have been. So let us say that in all willing there is first a plurality of sensations, namely the sensation of the state away from which, the sensation of the state towards which, the sensations of this from and towards themselves, and then also an accompanying muscular sensation which even without our putting into motion arms and legs begins its action by force of habit as soon as we will anything. Why does he say this? Well, he's said that willing is complicated, and he's backing up that claim, which is to say there's a whole network of sensations, of feelings, of even physiological affects that are all a part of this process of willing. That there is a general directionality in willing towards something, away from another thing. And so this is going to start, this is an explanation of willing that is using multiplicities. It's using a whole different set of facts about willing that will come together to describe this complex process from many different angles. So, even without our putting into motion arms and legs, we have this action or by force of habit as soon as we will anything. Therefore, just as sensations, and indeed many kinds of sensations, are to be recognized as ingredients of the will, so secondly should thinking also be considered an activity of the will. So for Nietzsche now, sensations and thinking are activities, or as he says, ingredients of the will. So that's complex because there's so many different sensations and thoughts that we can have. Thinking of the will as a singular sort of willing agent is now even more difficult. So in every act of the will there is a ruling thought. Let us not imagine it possible to sever this thought from the willing, as if in any will would then remain over. Third, the will is not only a complex of sensation and thinking, but is above all an affect. and specifically the affect of the command. This is going to be the key to this whole section, and I think one of the most important parts of Nietzsche, which is to say that you cannot command without at the same time being obedient. This idea of willing is taking a sort of willing over the self. The sort of obedience that we're going to get with reference to command is a split self, or a schizophrenic self, if we're going to look forward to Deleuze. So we're going to split the self into being both the commander and the obedient one at the same time, instead of just being the commander. The desire to be a free will, to be the willing one, is the desire to be only commander and not obedient. And this is impossible. This is a fundamental misevaluation of what it means to will, or what it means to be an agent. So, that which is termed freedom of the will is essentially the affect of superiority in relation to him who must obey. I am free, which is to say, he must obey. I am free, he must obey. This consciousness is inherent in every will. So, for example, when I make a decision that is, as it were, difficult, I'm making this difficult decision at odds with myself. There's presumably multiple choices that I could make, with multiple reasons leaning me one way or another. Whichever decision I make coalesces into a singular command. And so when I make that decision and I say, I choose this, I want to celebrate my victory in overcoming my opposition. I want to celebrate my free agency in being able to make the choice, in being able to make the command and live it out. I choose to work out. And then when I successfully lift weights and work out, I feel as if I have been free. But I wasn't. I enslaved myself to do a specific activity. The only free part of me was the singular part of me that happened to want to work out. But the part of me that wanted to eat Cheetos and play video games had to obey. That was not free. It didn't win the fight, as it were. So I, as a totality, am not free in that situation. I have to condense myself into a singular point in order to make the command in the first place. And only in so doing do I get the experience of being a commander, a free agent. But that experience of being on top is always accompanied by the discipline that is required to make the command. So in every free act or pursuit of freedom or pursuit of sincere or meaningful willing, there is, an equal feeling of obedience to this given command. It is impossible to have one without the other. So, I am free, he must obey. This consciousness is inherent in every will, and equally so the straining of the attention, the straight look that fixes itself exclusively on one aim, the unconditional evaluation that this and nothing else is necessary now. The inward certainty that obedience will be rendered, and whatever else belongs to the position of the commander. A man who wills commands something within himself that renders obedience, or that he believes renders obedience. So when we are commanding, we are always commanding ourselves at the very least, if not also other people. There is no such thing as being simply a commander and not obedient at the same time. There is no freedom without obedience. There is no dancing without chains or order. If you see sort of an amazing dancer, they may look like they are free, but, the best dancers are, of course, are the least free. They have mastered the craft because they're doing specifically what is necessary in order to master the craft. They wouldn't be able to perform those movements if they hadn't, rigorously trained. So the level of obedience is often proportional to what is accomplished through what we perceive to be our free willing, but in every free willing there is constraint. So who really is it that is willing? Well, it's either the entire complex, in which case it's partial willing, or it's hard to say. But anyway. Okay, so now Nietzsche says, let's notice what is strangest about the will. This manifold thing for which the people have only one word, willing, inasmuch as in the given circumstances we are at the same time the commanding and the obeying parties. And as the obeying party, we know the sensations of constraint, impulsion, pressure, resistance, and motion, which usually begin immediately after the act of willing. So, immediately after the specific act of willing, which is to say, of wanting something specific, of willing some specific action. But this is never always just free. It's constraining, right? If I want to go out on the lake on a boat, I will that. I make the decision that this is what I want or what I will for myself. But now the constraints start to come into place. Like, what do I have to do? Where do I find a boat to rent? How much will it cost? So the willing is just a small part of a whole network of various processes. But it feels good, and it's tied to our egoic or ideological desire to be this commanding or king, to be in control of our lives. And we always hedge towards the other side of truth in this regard. We always hedge towards believing we're on top, when I think it's more the case that we're always on top and the bottom at the same time. Or we're always on top, on the bottom, and on the sides, and then, we need to stop thinking in terms of just, I am an agent, I choose, I will. It's overly simple interpretation of the self, and it's not accurate. So it's doing you harm by having this idea. Having an inaccurate conception of yourself is not good. This conception of the self as a commanding singular agent or will is not correct. Therefore, it's not good for you. I'm just saying this. Nietzsche's not saying this here because this would be a moral claim. But anyway, okay. So the obeying and the commanding parties are both there at the same time in every instance. And as the obeying party, we know the sensations of constraint after the act of will, inasmuch as, on the other hand, we are accustomed to disregard this duality, and to deceive ourselves about it by means of the synthetic concept I. So we try to synthesize the complexity of our own nature into a singular self. And the self is most simple when we've made a singular decision or are willing one particular thing. If I say I'm, voting for this politician, that's a very singular act of will. Or if I identify solely with this political party, I get to coalesce my will into a singular identity. I get to wear a nice mask that veils the complexities and the confusion inside. So it's a sort of delusion that we actively pursue to hide from our true selves. We want to oversimplify ourselves to pretend that we understand ourselves more than we really do. And so in this, we create the I, the simple self, the placeholder self. A whole series of erroneous conclusions thus result from the very simple notion of an I. We get lost in this labyrinth of speaking, of language, of false presuppositions, and we forget that we aren't this simple thing. So the false evaluations of the will itself has become attached to the act of willing, and thus is also inherent to the very notion of modern philosophy, to such a degree that he who wills believes sincerely that willing suffices for action, since in the great majority of cases there has been exercise of will only when the effect of the command, that is, obedience, that is, the action, was to be expected. The appearance has translated itself into the feeling, as if there were a necessity of effect. In short, he who wills believes with a fair amount of certainty that will and action are somehow one, and then ascribes it as a success, the carrying out of their will. They've succeeded. They've manifested themselves out into the world, and thereby enjoys an increase in the sensation of power, which accompanies all success. Now, is this false? Well, from the perspective of the self, if we really examine the self, it is. Because as much as we are acting out in against the world, we are also suppressing or commanding, demanding a certain order from a great proportion of our own many souls. That phrase is going to come up soon. We're going to look at what that means. So now the next says this, freedom of the will, that is the expression for the complex state of delight of the person exercising volition. Finally, being able to exercise volition is a nice thing to happen in your life. You've succeeded, or you're manifesting your will. Not many people get to have a singular individualized will. More often, their will is sort of reacting to whatever life throws at them. I need to pay the bills. I need to do this. I need to do that. But these demands and these desires are given to us. But to actually make a serious willing decision is to concentrate the self into a singularity and to sort of pretend that there is an agent making a singular decision. This feels good, and it even potentially is good. There's nothing necessarily wrong with this. But what is wrong is the interpretation of it when we admit that it is singular, or we pretend that it is a singular willing process. So, in this way, the person exercising volition adds the feeling of delight of his successful executive instruments, the useful underwills or undersouls. Indeed, our body is but a social structure composed of many souls, to his feelings of delight as commander. So this analogy is not new in philosophy. It reminds me immediately of the Republic. The Republic is an analogy between the state and the self, where the individuals in the state are analogous to many sort of selves or aspiring affects in our self. So let's just think of a simple example. If I love eating candy, or I just want to have some sweets, there's certain democratic party on my tongue that wants sweets. There's desire, the willing is there. Is it my will? Sometimes, if I cave and buy some ice cream or some Sour Patch candies, copyright rules, I don't know. But this sort of like a battle that goes on. Our body is composed of many souls. What does that mean? Many wills, many tugs or threads or strings that pull us one way or another in the complex, complex existence that we are embedded in. And so when we are able to will a singular thing, that is a special event. It can feel good. It's sort of a simple thing in contrast to what is often not simple. And so this is why a lot of people get over-attached to things like political identity and whatnot. So regardless, the construction of the self is this sort of willing. Willing is not inherent to the self, philosophically speaking. What philosophers so far have been talking about when they talk about willing is a final stage in a process. It is a special event when the self is able to be relatively simple, but also deceiving. It's overly simple at the same time. It's not really that simple, ever. Okay. So here's what happens in every well-constructed and happy commonwealth, which is the governing class identifies itself with the successes of the commonwealth. In all willing, it is absolutely a question of commanding and obeying, on the basis, as already said, of a social structure composed of many souls. So this is essential for a healthy individual to identify with the parts of them that they're sort of commanding over. Right? So, my desire to eat sweets is not my sinful devil nature that is inherently corrupt. It's my like of pleasure and feeling good tastes. It's not morally bad. So, I shouldn't examine or critique or morally condemn parts of myself because they're parts of me, right? Whereas a religious person will compartmentalize their entire identity and basically end up only identifying with a very small part of what they actually are. When in reality they are much more, and when they encounter themselves, they will encounter demons and sins and all of their scary things, when really they're just running into themselves. For Nietzsche, so the getting to this self prior to the act of willing, and extending the self beyond the mere act of willing to thoughts, sensations, affects. He's showing that this whole process is much more complex than Descartes passed it off to be, and the transcendental idealists like Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel will also speak of the self as the ego as an immediate certainty, as a sort of key building block in a series of determinations in their philosophy. I believe it is Fichte who begins his entire philosophical system indebted to Descartes. Descartes' ego as the key sort of axiom, the most certain thing upon which a philosophical system can be built. Nietzsche's saying, no, the will is not certain at all. If you think the will is certain, you're wrong. You know, you're trying to find certainty, but it's not going to be found here, and I'm going to say why, because we're not taking any of this into account. Okay, I made a cut. To finish this off, I want to start here with this last sentence that Nietzsche offers us. It gives us a very clear insight into his idea of what the will is and its relation to morals, and also what morals are. So if this is a key insight into Nietzsche's philosophy about what morality is, and so let's look at this sentence here. Hence, a philosopher should claim the right to include willing as such within the sphere of morals. So it's funny because the fact that willing is just within the sphere of morals implies that there are morals that are not tied to willing. And that's actually, I think, very important here, because he goes on to say, morals being understood as, now he's defining morals for us, very important sentence, the doctrine of the relations of supremacy under which the phenomenon of life comes to be. So basically, the relations of supremacy being which forces win out over other forces. I'm imagining here a topography of forces, of, as he refers to above, he calls them the many souls or the undersouls. Imagine a person feeling cognitive dissonance, multiple desires at the same time. A person who has to make a difficult decision experiences the voices of many possible opinions or souls pulling and tugging at what one feels is the will. So what is morals is this basically the doctrines of these relations of what ends up going on in life. So Nietzsche's here is giving us an image of morality that is sort of almost biological or maybe even metaphysical, because it's prior to and beyond in the sense that it is more than just matters of willing. Willing is in the matter of morals, but what is willing? Well, willing is sort of this crowning event of, after one's morals have happened to succeed in the superiority of life, if one happens to be successful, then one wants to take as much credit for one's success as is possible, and this is where the will helps us. You know, the will allow us to take credit for the totality of effects and the whole sea of chance that happens to coalesce into the event that is the success of a certain desired will, an important will, within the many. So it's sort of a lie. And he says, you know, when we say, "Thus I willed this, I am the effect," it's what happens, Nietzsche says, in a well-constructed and happy commonwealth. So when things are going well in a country, you know, who is it that's going to take credit for that? The well-being? Is it the hard workers, the proletariat? No, it's going to be the governing class. Identifies itself with the success of the Commonwealth. It wants to pretend that its will comes to a head in a singularity through it as king. And this kind of reminds me a little bit of Hegel's philosophy of right. But, you know, there's a critique here which says that no, it doesn't need to. It's sort of a deception for the king to claim that they are the deciding factor of success or failure in this this instance of superiority in this successful commonwealth. What the successes really are about is more likely the many people who contribute to the success, the masses. In terms of our bodies, our prior habits and instincts, our upraising, our mentors and teachers as we grow up, the books that we're fortunate enough to be able to pick up and be influenced by, the land in which we're born into, the gender in which we're assigned. All of these sort of features coalesce. Each strand is important and will have its own voice and will play a significant role in your identity. So the idea of a singular will is sort of a way to try and simplify the complex situation you find yourself in. Nonetheless, as philosophers, we prioritize understanding first. So what use do we have of this simplification? Let us not rely on this. Instead, we should see the greater topography of differences here. Anyway, that's 17, 18, and 19. Thank you very much. Don't forget to like and subscribe.